Alright, so I wanted to go over some random stuff about subsurface scattering to make stuff like wax in particular look a little bit nicer, and also talk again about mesh lights and emission. So I have this crappy little candle scene set up, and hopefully I'm going to try to like sort of pause while my stuff is rendering, but I just sort of threw this together. So basically what I have now is this is just a standard AI surface shader. This little flame, it just sort of has some emission on it. I've not changed the color. I've not done anything else to it. And you can see that this is pretty much what we get so far. And it looks pretty unrealistic. I mean, for one, nothing's really lit except like the direct inside of this candle. Whereas theoretically, this should be bright enough where it's like shining through the candle and like making some interesting reflections and such like that. So what we can do is theoretically, like right now, like I said, this is just emission. If we go in and we set this up to like 10 or something crazy, you will see that this does get brighter. The flame itself gets pretty overexposed. The inside of the sort of quote-unquote light here gets a little bit more exposed, but the candle still looks pretty awful. We're not getting any light anywhere else in the scene. So we're going to look at how, like, I guess a few different ways to sort of approach that today. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'll set this back to 1. And the first thing that we're going to do is go into the wax shader itself. And there is a preset, I believe, for wax. So I'm just going to go ahead and replace that, see what happens. You will notice that the color of this changes a little bit, but not like super crazy drastically. I question why the candle is now pink, but that's a separate issue. So what we're going to do is look at the subsurface tab, and Redshift has a pretty similar tab to this. Interestingly, actually, they've not turned on any subsurface scattering, but you notice that as we slide the weight slider for subsurface up, we're getting a little bit more light diffusion coming through the candle itself. So instead of this just being completely black, my cat is sitting on me and using my hand as a headrest. Instead of this being completely black, we're getting a little bit of that nice sort of candle fade. You can see that the light is sort of dispersing through that candle and falling off. It's also taking longer to render, but you're going to get a much nicer looking candle out of it. So anywho, and I don't generally recommend these weird geometry flames. You can do them nicer than I just did them, but, you know, whatever. So I'm going to go ahead and actually take this candle flame, and I'm just going to go ahead and swap that out entirely for a mesh light. So I'm going to pause this while I do it. I get a little bit more control with the mesh light, and I find that to be preferable in instances like this. So I'm just going to go ahead and label this flame. Sorry, cat. He's really doesn't want me to move. So I'm just going to go Arnold, lights, and mesh light. And when we render this, nothing particularly interesting is happening. I'm just going to go ahead and set the exposure up to 50, like a crazy person. And it's going to make my scene super blown out. I just, for some reason, find this the easiest way to actually do exposure, where it's like super bright, and then you can just sort of take it back down to where you want it. So in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and use color temperature. What the heck? I'm going to pause that. You gonna let me click the color temperature buttons? That'd be great. All right. I will not be using color temperature apparently, because Maya is no. But either way, I'm just gonna sort of assign this like a orangey color for that light. And you can see it's pretty overexposed, like right in this area. But as we go through the downer part of the candle, that's words, you can see that it sort of falls off to like red, and you get this like a little bit of like interesting effect in there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how that works. And again, hopefully, I'll try to sort of talk you through what I'm doing over here. Hopefully the video won't be super laggy. I've not found a great way to fix that yet. But anywho, so the first thing I want to do, so I want that flame to actually be rendering in the scene, because that's going to look a little bit less crazy. So I'm going to go into my mesh light, and I'm just going to do show original mesh, and then we'll get that little flame at least sort of showing up in there. Now it is going to render with the emission and such that we have set, but I'm just going to kind of call that acceptable for the time being. Now the next one we want to fix, there's sort of multiple issues with this scene. One, the top of the candle is absurdly overexposed. And part of that is just because where I've positioned the flame. It is pretty low in the candle instead of like floating up. So that's likely just going to sort of stay slightly overexposed. But what we want to look at is the settings for, we can look at the settings for the light, and we can look at the settings for the subsurface scattering. And in this case, I'm going to try the subsurface scattering first. Cool. Alright, let's go into your shader. And basically what subsurface scattering is light coming into an object, instead of just hitting it and bouncing off, it sort of gets sucked in, bounced around, the color changes a little bit, and then it gets thrown back out of the object. So if you've ever seen something like, you know, light shining behind someone's ear and their ear is red, that's subsurface scattering. So we can go ahead and just kind of mess with the weight of this a little bit. The weight is basically same thing as any other weight in Maya. It's how much subsurface scattering is there. So in this case, if we make this perhaps a little bit less aggressive, right? So like the candle, theoretically, you're not going to get light scattering through the entire body of the candle. That's a little bit excessive. So what's probably going to happen is like a little bit of like overexposure here, and then it kind of fades off to like normal looking wax up or like lower in the candle. So there's a few things you can play with. Weight is just sort of how much subsurface scattering is there, and then scale also affects this. And to be honest, I have a little bit of a hard time describing scale, but you'll notice like in this case, as we play with the scale here, the subsurface scattering is sort of systematically moving its way up the candle. So I'll just sort of keep setting that down and be like, all right, maybe that looks like a sort of decent place to have the light sort of fall off. And this will, again, return to sort of normal candle look down here. And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and just sort of do that. The lighting still looks a little bit crazy. I want to say a little bit crazy, I mean, this looks more like skin than wax, which is actually interesting because I have a hard time replicating skin, and the wax looks more like skin than the skin that I've tried to do, which is kind of annoying. But anywho. So you'll notice we also have the subsurface color and the radius. So the subsurface color is basically what color, so if we set this to green, it's going to be what color is the scattering. So like when the light comes in, basically what color does it take on after bouncing around in the mesh. So a lot of times I'll change this to something really strange just so I can be like, all right, where exactly is the subsurface scattering happening? And clearly anywhere that's bright green now has subsurface scattering taking effect on it. And I'm also going to go through and just set this to be like red for the rest of the candle. So you get this really clear distinction of where is the subsurface scattering occurring and where is the base shader happening. Because sometimes if you're working with like similar colors, it's a little bit just hard to figure out what exactly is going on. So that's just sort of my weird way to work with that. And then from there we can go ahead and play with, honestly, a lot of times I just sort of play with these settings until I get something that I like. So like usually I'll mess with scale and weight first, just to see like, all right, like let me knock it back so it's in the rough area that I want, and then you can sort of play with the radius and the subsurface color afterwards. So in this case the radius is basically, I'm going to sort of choose to think of it and describe it as if you're looking at like a outer glow or an inner glow in Photoshop, like the size and blur of that is sometimes how I will think of the radius. So in this case I do actually kind of like the larger radius, and I might give this like a tiny bit more on scale, just so that glow is like coming a little bit farther down, but like not hopefully insanely farther down. So this is sort of the basics of subsurface scattering. You can usually find different sort of resources online about, I guess, the sort of subsurface scatter color of different things. There's a lot of presets for stuff like skin and wax and all that good stuff. So when in doubt, look at pictures of reference. You can Google what is subsurface color of wax, and you'll probably get some good information on that. Probably some people have already made presets for this, which you might sort of use and modify. But But in this case, I'm going to go ahead and try to make this actually look a little bit more like a candle instead of some kind of green alien stick. Quote of the day, green alien stick. So instead of having the subsurface color be bright green, I'm going to go ahead and be like, all right, this is probably going to be some kind of very like light sort of orangey color. And I want this candle to, instead of being bright red, to be maybe kind of more of like a yellow, mostly white-ish kind of color. So as we look at that, you can see that sort of changes the way the candle looks. And to an extent, the light color and the light intensity also has an effect on this. So what I'm going to do is actually go ahead and just set the light itself back to being white. And you can see that's having a pretty dramatic effect on the look of the candle. Instead of this being yellow, it's now actually white. So if we go back into our and this is like, subsurface scattering is like kind of a pain to refine, but like kind of fun once you get it right. So if we go back into our subsurface color, I'm going to mess with a few more things. So I'm going to look at the weight. So right now we can see like the light itself is shining super aggressively through this candle. So perhaps we need a little bit less intense subsurface scattering, so like less intense weight, basically. So there's just less light sort of being absorbed into the object. You can see that's knocking back some of the overexposure a little bit. I'm going to see what happens if I set scale down. That's excessive. To maybe 0.3, maybe 0.4, perhaps. And I'll just sort of play with different values until I get something that I'm relatively happy with. And in this case, I've taken my settings down very aggressively. So weight is 0.01 and scale is 0.4. And that's doing something that I find a little bit less crazy looking, where we have overexposed by the flame, which kind of makes sense, and then it falls off a little bit more aggressively. Excuse me. For the rest of that candle. So I'm going to say, like, cool, that's pretty alright. I don't hate that. I am going to go back in and look at this light again and be like, okay, maybe the exposure should come down a tiny bit because it does look a little bit insane. I feel like the light color is also not fantastic. I have issues meshing candle light color, so we're just going to say, like, cool, maybe this extreme orangey red is kind of not awful. And I do think that part of the strange color here is coming actually from the emission on my little flame color. So I'm going to go in and just sort of experiment with that. It's either the extra super yellow glow in here is could be from a few things. One, emission from the candle. I'm going to just turn off the original mesh entirely, so it's not the candle. My next guess is that it is the exposure of this. So a lot of times when we adjust exposure of a light, you'll notice like if we take the exposure way down, it's the color of this light is behaving more like what you would expect based on the color slider here. And then if you set the higher you set this setting, basically, the more sort of overexposed that area gets. So I'm not gonna lie, I've not found a fantastic way to actually counter that. You can see I've turned on a little light, and now we have a goofy little super overexposed glowy flame. So I've not found a huge amazing way to sort of counteract the fact that if you set the exposure up really high on this, it will turn yellow. It's just sort of what it is for me. If anyone happens to know of a great way to fix that, please let me know. That would be amazing. So you can adjust different sliders, like how much do you want this to show up in diffuse. And this is in the mesh light itself, so you can also turn off subsurface scattering entirely, basically, so that this light just has no effect on subsurface scattering. So theoretically, if you wanted to, what you could do to, because subsurface scattering takes a while to render, so what you could do is if you had other lights in your scene apart from this candle, you could turn off their subsurface scattering, then the extra lights would not affect the candle, it would just be that little candle flame affecting it. Now if you do this, you do run the risk stuff might look a little bit less realistic, but it'll also theoretically maybe save you render times if you have other bright lights on this. But either way. So, I mean, this is pretty much what we have. I'll just do a render of the whole scene. It looks pretty crazy. But that's going to take just forever to render. But you can see that, again, we do have sort of a, you know, nice little orange glow being cast from that candle. The other thing you could look at is how far do you really want that light to go? So I have absolutely no idea how far away I put these walls. I'm just going to go ahead and move them a little bit closer. Hello. A little bit closer to the candle itself. So in this I'm looking at mostly like, how do we get those nice little sort of glowing balls on the wall, I guess, from where that candle is affecting things. So in this case, you can see, like, again, we have hotter areas on the wall. In this case, I do think the flame is a little bit intense. It looks pretty aggressive. So I'm going to try taking down the exposure a tiny bit so that it's casting, I guess, a little bit softer glow. My hope here being that I could theoretically take it down enough where it would not blow out the candle super aggressively. But that doesn't seem to be the thing that's happening. So I'm going to say, like, all right, that's pretty all right, cool, don't hate that. And at this point, I might want to go through and look at, again, my subsurface scattering. Maybe, I'll just do 12, what the heck. So right now, like, all the nice stuff that we did on that candle has pretty much been obliterated because we've taken the exposure down. So I'm going to go ahead and just play with the, no, stop. I'm just going to go ahead and play a little bit with the scale and the weight of the subsurface scattering. So, for a very, very bright candle, you know, the 0.10 for the weight worked pretty well. I'm going to go ahead and see what happens if I just set that up to like 0.1. Alright, cool. And that's like not terrible, I guess, kind of. So basically what I've done is just go through and set the settings up a little bit so that it picks up more subsurface scattering from that light, instead of, like, when it's a dimmer light, you do actually see the subsurface scattering a little bit more. Yeah. So if you're looking at this from far away, we get something like this, which is, like, not super sexy, kind of is there, but it does give you that little bit of, like, sort of nice glow. One thing you could theoretically do if you wanted to, and I'm gonna, I think, leave this as a separate video, or like a next video, is go through and use light linking to theoretically try to make the top of this candle look a little bit less horrific. So, new videos.